On a first-class flight, an arrogant and prejudiced flight attendant insulted a modest passenger without realizing it was Melania Trump, the powerful and renowned former First Lady. When the truth was revealed, she faced the consequences of the biggest mistake of her career. Where are you watching this story? Share in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to catch more thought-provoking stories. Melania Trump walked gracefully through JFK Airport's terminal, leaving behind the gleaming lights of advertisements and the bustling crowd. After a week filled with social events and political meetings, she chose a commercial flight instead of her private jet, not out of frugality but to enjoy a sense of normalcy and escape the constant scrutiny of the public eye. That day, Melania opted for an outfit that was simple yet elegant: a cream turtleneck sweater, dark tailored pants, and oversized sunglasses that covered nearly half her face. A small black handbag completed her understated yet sophisticated look. She wore minimal makeup, a light foundation and natural lipstick, giving her a striking contrast to her usual glamorous public image. At the security checkpoint, none of the staff recognized the famous passenger. They noticed her composed demeanor and the quiet elegance she carried, but had no inkling that this was the former First Lady. This anonymity put Melania at ease. There were no forced smiles, no selfies to pose for. This flight was hers alone. As she stepped into the first-class cabin, Melania moved naturally, barely making a sound. She gently placed her carry-on in the overhead compartment and settled into the window seat. The sunlight streaming through the window softly lit her face. She removed her sunglasses and gazed out at the runway, savoring a rare moment of calm amidst her busy life. In another corner of the first-class cabin, Sarah Montgomery, the head flight attendant, was scanning the passenger list meticulously. With her neatly styled brown hair and impeccable uniform, Sarah exuded professionalism. Having over 15 years of experience working on high-end commercial flights, Sarah prided herself on maintaining order and delivering top-tier service in the first-class cabin. As Sarah's eyes moved down the list and back to the passengers already seated, her attention landed on the woman by the second-row window. Melania's modest attire didn't match the typical image Sarah associated with first-class travelers. Usually, they wore designer clothes, flaunted expensive jewelry, or, at the very least, exuded an air of ostentatious wealth. Sarah took a deep breath, telling herself she needed to verify this passenger's identity. She couldn't afford to make a mistake, but neither could she allow any irregularities to compromise the standards of the first-class cabin she was responsible for. With a professional demeanor, Sarah approached Melania, ready to start a conversation that she had no idea would change the course of the entire flight. Sarah walked slowly through the first-class cabin, her sharp eyes scanning every detail. With 15 years of experience, she knew that even the slightest negligence could spell trouble. To her, every first-class flight wasn't just a service, it was a flawless performance. The seats had to be spotless, the champagne glasses sparkling under the lights, and the passengers, the crème de la crème of society, had to exude the demeanor befitting their status. As Sarah passed Melania, something made her pause. This woman, with her unassuming appearance, didn't fit Sarah's image of a first-class passenger. No designer bag, no expensive watch, no dazzling jewelry, just a quiet but confident presence. Sarah couldn't deny there was something captivating about her, but the minimalism triggered a tinge of suspicion. Sarah stepped closer, maintaining a polite smile, though her eyes were full of scrutiny. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, her tone gentle but slightly firm. "I need to check your ticket." Again. Melania's expression remained unchanged. Calmly, she reached into a small handbag and handed Sarah her ticket without the slightest hint of discomfort. Sarah glanced at the ticket. First class, the seat number perfectly matching her current spot. There was no indication of any mistake, but that didn't ease Sarah's unease. "Thank you, ma'am," Sarah said, returning the ticket. Yet she lingered for an extra second, her gaze sweeping over Melania's cream-colored sweater, searching for something, anything, that could confirm this woman truly belonged here. Melania offered a faint smile and tucked the ticket back into her bag. There was no defensiveness or irritation in her demeanor. Her composed attitude left Sarah feeling slightly disarmed, but her pride wouldn't allow her to dismiss the doubt so easily. Back in the cruise area, Sarah placed the passenger list down and crossed her arms. Emily, a younger flight attendant with only a few years of experience, noticed Sarah's dissatisfied expression and asked curiously, "Is everything all right? You look a bit worried." Sarah shrugged, her eyes still drifting toward the first-class cabin. "The woman in the second row, she doesn't look like a first-class passenger. No designer. Bags, no jewelry. I'm not sure who she is." Emily frowned slightly. "But her ticket is valid, right?" "It is," Sarah admitted, though her tone carried obvious hesitation. "But, you know, Emily, experience will teach you that not everyone is who they claim to be. I just want to be sure. She looks a little too simple." Emily looked at Sarah, a hint of uncertainty on her face. "Maybe she just wants to be comfortable. Not everyone likes to flaunt their wealth, you." "No?" Sarah didn't reply, merely pressing her lips together. In her mind, the perfection of this flight depended on ensuring nothing unusual occurred. And this woman, with her understated appearance but lack of any fear or reservation, remained a big question mark. When Sarah returned to the first-class cabin, Melania was quietly reading a fashion magazine. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the window, casting a soft glow over her face. The scene, though ordinary, only deepened Sarah's confusion. She stood in the aisle, neither approaching nor looking away. There was something about this woman that made it impossible for Sarah to shake the feeling that she was missing something crucial. But what? Sarah couldn't be certain, and that was the moment she decided to keep a closer watch. Because if something wasn't right, she wanted to be the first to know. Sarah stepped into the service area with an unreadable expression. Inside, the other flight attendants were busy preparing meals for the first-class cabin. The soft clinking of cutlery and the faint aroma of gourmet dishes added to the organized bustle of the space. Sarah placed the passenger list on the counter, a contemplative look flickering in her eyes. Emily, a young flight attendant with her black hair tied up in a neat ponytail, noticed Sarah's demeanor. Her youthful curiosity led her to lean in slightly and ask, "Miss Sarah, is something wrong? Who was that woman? She doesn't seem like the type. Who usually flies first class?" Sarah gave a faint smile, but it couldn't conceal the doubt lingering in her mind. She could just be someone wealthy who doesn't like to flaunt it, but there's also a chance. It's a mistake. Emily nodded, agreeing, but not overly concerned. To her, passengers were all the same, just people she served during a flight. But Sarah was different. With 15 years of experience, she trusted her instincts. "Listen," Sarah continued, lowering her voice, "I'm not trying to judge, but you know how it is. First-class passengers have a certain presence. Their clothes, demeanor, even the way they step onto the plane exude sophistication. But that woman, Something doesn't add up." Emily shrugged and smiled. "Maybe she just prefers simplicity. I've met a few like that. Rich people who don't feel the need to show off. No big deal." Sarah stayed silent for a moment, her sharp eyes unwavering in their focus. It wasn't personal. She didn't dislike Melania. In fact, she didn't even know her. But Sarah's suspicion wasn't about the woman herself. It stemmed from her sense of duty. She believed she was paid to ensure everything on the flight was flawless, from the food to the people. As the meals were nearing completion, Sarah suddenly remembered an incident from the past. A man who had posed as a VIP passenger to sneak into first class. He had used an old ticket and a sharp suit to deceive the crew. That debacle had earned Sarah's team a harsh reprimand. An uneasy feeling crept in. She turned to Emily with a firm tone. "I think I need to double-check. We can't afford any mistakes." Emily looked up surprised. "You think she's someone suspicious? Didn't her ticket check out?" Sarah nodded, almost as if justifying herself. "Yes, it did. But just because something appears legitimate doesn't mean it's safe. I've seen. Clever people fool us because we trusted appearances too much." Emily didn't argue, though she privately thought Sarah might be overreacting. Still, she knew Sarah was a perfectionist. When something didn't sit right with her, she wouldn't rest until she got to the bottom of it. Sarah left the service area, her gaze this time lingering on Melania. The woman remained seated, her eyes fixed on a fashion magazine, seemingly unbothered and unaware of the scrutiny. But that calmness made Sarah even more uneasy. The composure, no tension, no restlessness, seemed entirely at odds with someone out of place. Sarah took a deep breath. If she was going to resolve this, it had to be now. With confidence in her abilities, she walked back to the first-class cabin, determined to confront the mysterious woman once more. The feeling driving her wasn't just responsibility. It was an insistent need to uncover the truth, no matter how complicated that truth might turn out to be. Sarah walked slowly down the aisle, each step as if carefully weighing every possibility. Her gaze swept across the first-class cabin but didn't linger on anyone except Melania, who was still engrossed in the magazine in her hands. The woman seemed either unaware of Sarah's presence or deliberately ignoring it. Sarah stopped beside Melania, taking a deep breath before speaking. "Ma'am," she began, her voice gentle but edged with firmness, "we need to verify your identity to ensure the flight's security." Melania looked up slowly, her piercing blue eyes locking onto Sarah's. In that moment, Sarah felt as though she was standing before a powerful figure. Yet the woman's simple appearance made it hard to associate her with anyone Sarah might recognize. Melania removed her sunglasses and placed them on the table next to her seat. Tilting her head slightly, she replied in a warm but resolute tone, "I believe the ticket should suffice for verification. I'm simply looking for a quiet flight." Sarah hesitated at the calmness of Melania's response, but suspicion still weighed heavily on her mind. No one in first class maintained such composure when questioned. It was an unnatural reaction, at least in Sarah's experience. Lowering her voice, but imbuing it with greater weight, Sarah pressed on. "Ma'am, I understand you have a first-class ticket. However, this is a premium flight, and we have a responsibility to ensure absolute security for all passengers. If you cannot provide further information, I'll have to ask you to leave the first-class cabin." The tension between the two women thickened, like a taut string ready to snap at any moment. passengers nearby began to take notice, their curious glances cutting through the silence. Some leaned toward one another, whispering as they speculated about what was unfolding. Melania maintained her unyielding gaze, unfazed. She slowly placed the magazine on her lap, her hands clasped together. Her voice, though quiet, seemed to slice through the air. "I don't believe I need to prove anything further. You're disrupting me and disturbing the other passengers. Perhaps you should return to your duties." Her words struck directly at Sarah's sense of authority. For the first time in her career, Sarah felt as though she was losing control of the situation. She questioned if she had gone too far, but quickly dismissed the thought. Taking a step closer, she kept her voice steady. "Ma'am, I must emphasize that this is not harassment. This is responsibility. If you refuse to cooperate, I'm afraid we'll have no choice but to ask you to leave." Those words made the atmosphere in the first-class cabin feel suffocating. The other passengers, accustomed to the tranquility of this space, began paying more attention. A middle-aged woman, seated in the row behind, leaned toward her husband and whispered, "What's going on? Who is that woman? Why is the flight attendant being so insistent?" The man shook his head, his eyes fixed on Melania. "I'm not sure, but she looks familiar." Melania remained silent. She stood up, her posture straight yet retaining the elegance of a lady. Though her actions revealed no anger, they carried an unmistakable message. She would not tolerate this unfair treatment any longer. She met Sarah's eyes with a calm yet unwavering voice. "If you truly believe I don't belong here, I'm willing to leave. But remember, not everyone needs to prove their worth just because they don't fit into your expectations." Her words froze Sarah in place, but before she could respond, a voice rang out from behind, shattering the oppressive atmosphere. "Wait, don't you recognize her?" Sarah turned, her bewildered eyes landing on a middle-aged man who had risen from his seat in the back row. And then, the words he spoke next left everyone in the first-class cabin stunned. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin seemed to thicken as the tension between Sarah and Melania escalated. A murmur began to ripple through the typically quiet space. A middle-aged man seated nearby leaned toward his wife and whispered, "Something seems off, but she looks familiar. Who do you think she is?" His wife, a woman in a red blazer, glanced quickly at Melania, her gaze assessing but not overtly intrusive. "She might be some sort of businesswoman, but if she's important, why would the flight attendant give her such a hard time?" A short distance away, a businesswoman in a black dress holding a glass of wine leaned toward her travel companion. "Probably just a misunderstanding, but she's handling it with such composure. She definitely carries herself like someone with power." Her companion, a young attorney, nodded in agreement. "True, but why does the flight attendant seem so tense? She looks like she's about to. Throw her out of the cabin." Meanwhile, Sarah was struggling to regain control of the situation. Melania's words, calm but commanding, made her feel judged, not just by the woman in front of her, but by all the passengers now watching. The perfection Sarah prided herself on maintaining during every flight seemed to be unraveling bit by bit. She glanced around. The stares of the other passengers bore down on her, not with empathy, but with curiosity and a hint of judgment. The sensation of being surrounded only heightened her unease. Turning back to Melania, Sarah tried to steady her voice, though it betrayed a hint of rigidity. "Ma'am, I don't mean to cause any inconvenience, but I must ensure that everything on this flight remains safe and in accordance with regulations. I kindly ask for your cooperation to avoid unnecessary trouble." Melania didn't respond immediately. Instead, she slowly took her seat, her calm gaze sweeping over Sarah before she replied, "I don't believe following regulations requires inconveniencing passengers unnecessarily." Melania's words cut deep, sharp as a blade, slicing through Sarah's professional pride. The confidence that had guided her throughout her career now morphed into an uncomfortable sense of embarrassment. Behind them, the other passengers began whispering more animatedly. An elderly man in a neatly tailored suit discreetly pulled out his phone and searched for images. After a moment, he leaned toward the person next to him and murmured, "I think I know who she is." "Who?" the young woman beside him asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. He held up his phone screen, which displayed a photo of Melania Trump. "It's her, First Lady Melania Trump." His words ignited a spark that quickly spread through the cabin. Passengers began staring more intently at Melania, some even pulling out their own phones to confirm. "Really? Melania Trump? But what's she doing here?" one passenger exclaimed. "Impossible! How could the flight attendant not recognize her?" another whispered, their voice tinged with disbelief and indignation. Sarah noticed the shift in the atmosphere but still didn't understand what was happening. She became acutely aware of the growing number of eyes on her. Then a voice cut through the lingering silence. "Don't you recognize her? That's Melania Trump." Sarah whipped around to face the man who had spoken. Her heart sank as her gaze returned to Melania. The face she had assumed belonged to an ordinary passenger now emerged as a familiar, iconic visage. A wave of confusion and dread swept over Sarah as she realized she had made a monumental mistake. The elderly passenger's remark rang out like a bell in the quiet atmosphere, drawing the astonished and curious gazes of everyone in the first-class cabin. Sarah stood frozen in place, her hands suddenly awkward, unsure where to put them. She turned to look at the man who had just spoken. His eyes were steady, full of certainty, as if he had just solved a great mystery. But her attention quickly shifted back to the woman in front of her, Melania Trump. Melania remained seated, her sharp blue eyes unblinking, like a mirror reflecting the turmoil swirling inside Sarah's mind. She said nothing, didn't smile, and didn't show anger. Yet her silence struck harder than any words ever could. Sarah felt blood rush to her face, her heart pounding as though she had just been unmasked as the villain in a play. Desperately trying to hide her emotions, she spoke, her voice trembling slightly but still maintaining a professional tone. I'm so sorry if I've caused you any trouble, but—" She trailed off, unable to find a convincing reason to justify her actions. Deep down, she knew Melania didn't need to prove anything. All Sarah was left with was an undeniable sense of shame. A young passenger nearby, holding a phone in hand, chuckled softly. "She is Melania Trump. Look at this. It's unmistakable. How could anyone not recognize her?" Sarah glanced at the phone screen, where images of Melania Trump, dressed in glamorous gowns at major events, were clearly displayed. While the attire might differ, no one could deny the striking similarity in demeanor and elegance. The murmurs around the cabin grew louder, no longer discreet whispers. Some passengers began to criticize Sarah openly. How could this flight attendant handle the situation like that? A former First Lady, doubted like this? Ridiculous. She had a valid ticket. What's her problem? Sarah felt the weight of judgment pressing down on her, as though every pair of eyes was scrutinizing her every move. She suddenly realized it was her excessive suspicion and bias that had landed her in this mess. Melania rose from her seat, her posture exuding calm authority rather than anger. She looked at Sarah with a composed expression and spoke in a low, steady voice. "I don't think who I am should matter in how you treat a passenger." Her words froze Sarah in place. There was no yelling, no harsh language, just a profound meaning carried in each word. Melania didn't need to raise her voice. Her calm demeanor made Sarah feel guiltier than any reprimand could. "Ma'am, I'm truly sorry," Sarah stammered. "I didn't realize." Melania raised a hand to interrupt her. "You don't need to apologize for not recognizing me. The real issue is how you approached the situation. You judged me based on appearances, and that made not just me, but everyone else here uncomfortable." Other passengers nodded in agreement, with a few clapping softly to show their support for Melania. A woman, seated a row behind, even stood up and spoke firmly. "She's absolutely right. This is first class, but that doesn't mean we get to treat anyone like they don't belong." Sarah lowered her head, unable to say a word. Her heart was a swirl of shame and regret. She realized she had allowed arrogance and prejudice to overshadow the professionalism she had always prided herself on. As Melania returned to her seat, she added one final remark, her voice gentle but resolute. "I hope this experience helps you reconsider how you perceive and treat others. Respect shouldn't be based on someone's identity. It's something everyone deserves." Her words rang out like a declaration, not just for Sarah, but for the entire first-class cabin, now listening intently. Once again, Melania did what she did best, making people reflect deeply with her poise and exceptional wisdom. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin became so quiet that one could hear the faint hum of the engines from outside. Melania's words, gentle but weighty, rang out like a bell in the tense and judgmental space. Sarah stood frozen, trying to maintain an air of calm while a storm brewed inside her. Melania's words weren't just directed at her, they served as a reminder to everyone present. Melania's sharp gaze pierced through Sarah, not with anger or reproach, but with a quiet intensity that made Sarah feel as if she were being laid bare before an uncomfortable truth. Melania continued, her voice steady. "You see, I don't need to prove who I am to be treated with respect, but your actions today didn't just inconvenience me. They made me wonder how many others have endured similar judgment without the chance to speak up." Her words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding, like a quiet verdict. Passengers around them lowered their gazes, avoiding Melania's eyes. A few nodded subtly, as if recognizing their own tendencies to judge others based on appearances. Sarah felt her hands tremble. This wasn't just personal embarrassment. It was a direct blow to the pride and professionalism she had always held dear. She tried to find words to respond, but every excuse caught in her throat. "Ma'am, Sarah began, her voice shaking, but Melania gently shook her head, cutting her off. "There's no need to explain or apologize to me. What I hope is that you reflect deeply on how you do your job and treat others. This isn't just about me or you. It's about the kind of world we want to build." Sarah felt the weight of those words pulling her down. Any defense she might have mustered now seemed meaningless. She stood there, trying to steady her trembling body, but her eyes betrayed her, glistening with emotion. A middle-aged man, who had recognized Melania from the start, broke the silence. "She's right. We're too quick to judge others based on appearances. This is first class, but that doesn't mean respect is reserved for only a select few." His words delivered the final blow, leaving Sarah feeling utterly surrounded by an undeniable truth. Another woman, seated a few rows away, spoke softly. "To be honest, I thought she didn't belong here either. But now I realize I was wrong. Thank you for the lesson today." Melania inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement, a gesture of gratitude without triumph or arrogance. She didn't need that. Her demeanor spoke volumes, confident, composed, and firmly grounded in her belief in fairness. A wave of emotion rose within Sarah. She knew she had been wrong, not just in how she treated Melania, but in allowing prejudice to cloud her professionalism. She bowed her head, her voice trembling but sincere. "I deeply apologize for what happened. I let my bias overshadow my responsibilities. Thank you for reminding me of something far more important: respect without conditions." Melania looked at Sarah, her gaze softening. She didn't reply immediately, but her slight nod said it all. Sarah knew she had a chance to make things right, and she vowed never to let herself repeat such a mistake. As Melania returned to her seat, the other passengers gradually resumed their usual activities. But no one in the first-class cabin felt the same as before. Something had shifted, not just in Sarah, but in everyone. Sarah quietly retreated to the service area, her steps heavy with a sense of failure. Yet, deep within, she felt a faint glimmer of hope. This wasn't the end. It was a lesson, and she knew she would grow from it. As the atmosphere in the first-class cabin grew increasingly tense, a passenger seated near the aisle stood up and approached the flight attendants with a grave expression. He pointed towards Sarah and spoke loudly enough for the entire cabin to hear. "This flight attendant needs to know that this lady is Melania Trump. I suggest you address this matter immediately." The words spread like wildfire through the already strained space. One of the flight attendants quickly left the first-class cabin and headed to the cockpit to report to Captain William Hayes. Within minutes, the cockpit door opened. Captain William Hayes, a man in his 50s with an air of authority and a meticulously pressed uniform, stepped out. His calm yet serious demeanor commanded attention as he surveyed the first-class cabin, his eyes resting briefly on Melania before recognition dawned. "Mrs. Trump," he said, offering a polite smile and a respectful nod, "it is truly an honor to have you on our flight." Sarah, standing just a few steps away, froze. Embarrassment and confusion flooded her face as she realized the situation had spiraled far beyond her control. Turning to Sarah, the captain spoke in a firm yet composed tone. "Miss Montgomery, this is a distinguished guest. Please ensure she receives the highest level of service throughout the flight." Sarah bowed her head, her face flushed with humiliation. I deeply apologize, Captain. I didn't realize." Captain Hayes raised a hand, cutting her off. "Whether you realized it or not is irrelevant. What matters is how we treat our passengers. We are here to serve, not to judge." His words struck Sarah like a sharp blow to her pride, but she knew there was no room for argument. She bowed her head again, trying to steady herself under the weight of the stares directed at her. Melania, maintaining her usual composure, offered the captain a gentle smile. "Thank you, Captain Hayes. I believe this was just a small misunderstanding." Her soft yet clear tone conveyed that she had no intention of escalating the matter, a gesture that only deepened the admiration of those around her. Captain Hayes nodded, his gaze filled with respect. "We greatly appreciate your understanding, Mrs. Trump. Should you need anything, please, don't hesitate to let us know." With a courteous bow, he turned and gave Sarah one last look before heading back to the cockpit. Sarah stood rooted to the spot, feeling as though every light in the cabin was now focused on her, exposing all her mistakes and the biases she had unwittingly revealed. As the captain departed, the cabin gradually returned to its usual quiet, but the atmosphere had undeniably shifted. Other passengers whispered among themselves. Some shook their heads, while others smiled admiringly at Melania, as if they had just witnessed a master class in grace and diplomacy. Meanwhile, Sarah felt a deep sense of shame envelop her. She wondered why she had let prejudice cloud her professionalism, why she had allowed her instincts to judge rather than uphold the core values of her role. Melania said nothing further. She returned to her seat, picked up her magazine, and resumed reading as if nothing had happened. But for everyone else in the cabin, this incident would not soon be forgotten. Taking a deep breath, Sarah quietly retreated to the galley, knowing that this was more than just a difficult moment. It was a lesson she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Sarah stood still for a moment, watching Melania as she returned to her seat. Inside, she felt a wave of shame and regret, mixed with an unsettling sense of awakening. Melania sat down, adjusted the magazine on her lap, and then gently looked up at Sarah. There was no anger or reproach in her gaze, but the calmness carried a weight that unsettled Sarah more than any scolding could have. "Working in the service industry isn't easy," Melania began, her voice warm and composed. "I understand that, but respect should always be a priority, no matter who the person is." Sarah heard these words as if someone had placed a mirror in front of her, forcing her to confront herself. Prejudice, complacency, and the misguided belief that she was upholding standards, all of these had led her to this mistake. She lowered her head, her voice soft, almost a confession. "I'm truly sorry. I didn't think things through." Melania nodded, but said nothing more. She didn't need to. Her words had already done enough to make Sarah realize her error. As Sarah returned to the service area, she began rearranging the dinner trays, but her hands trembled slightly. Emily, the young flight attendant, noticed something was off and approached her. "Are you okay, Sarah?" Emily asked, her voice full of concern but tinged with curiosity. Sarah paused, her hands resting on the edge of the tray as if to steady herself. She took a deep breath and said quietly, "I made a mistake, Emily. A big one." Emily tilted her head, her expression surprised. This wasn't the Sarah she knew, the confident, polished, and proud professional. "We all make mistakes, Sarah," Emily offered comfortingly. "What matters is that you've realized it." Sarah stayed silent, feeling Emily's words pierce straight to her heart. Acknowledging a mistake was one thing, but correcting it and learning from it was something else entirely. Back in the first-class cabin, the atmosphere had calmed down. Passengers had returned to their books, magazines, or drinks. Yet curious glances and hushed whispers still lingered in the air. An older passenger, who had recognized Melania earlier, turned to the person sitting next to him. "It's rare to see someone of her stature handle things with such calm and grace. Not a single word of criticism, yet the lesson was crystal clear." The woman beside him nodded in agreement. "She didn't just make us reconsider how we treat others. She's made me reflect on myself." as well. In the service area, Sarah quietly sat in a corner, gripping a cleaning cloth as if seeking stability from the inanimate object. Melania's words echoed in her mind. She realized this wasn't just a minor workplace mishap. It was a profound lesson about how people perceive and treat one another. Throughout her career, Sarah had prided herself on professionalism and maintaining the highest standards for the flight she managed. But today, she understood that standards weren't just about appearances or strict control. They were also about how she treated others, without judgment, without prejudice, and always with basic respect. "I was wrong," she whispered to herself, admitting it fully for the first time. Sarah stood up, adjusted her uniform, and stepped out of the service area. She knew she couldn't change what had happened, but she could decide how to move forward. She walked back into the first-class cabin with a renewed determination. No passenger would ever feel disrespected under her care again, no matter who they were, what they looked like, or where they came from. She didn't say anything further to Melania, but deep inside she promised herself she would never forget this lesson, not just as a reminder of her job, but as a lesson about humanity. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin, which had returned to its usual quiet, was now quietly simmering. Whispers, sideways glances, and occasional nods were all directed toward Melania. A few passengers, unable to contain their curiosity, discreetly picked up their phones to snap photos from afar. A man sitting near the back of the cabin, a freelance journalist, quickly drafted a tweet. "Melania Trump on a commercial flight. A perfect example of poise and class. But the way a flight attendant treated her makes me reflect on biases in the service industry." His tweet, accompanied by a photo of Melania from behind as she quietly read a magazine, quickly went viral. Comments began pouring in, ranging from praise for Melania to criticism of the airline service. A young woman seated near Melania with neatly tied blonde hair and a laptop in front of her whispered to her companion, "That's really Melania Trump. I can't understand why they handled it that way. But she's amazing, not a hint of anger." Her companion, a sharp-dressed businessman in a tailored suit, nodded thoughtfully. "I think this will make the news soon. They picked the wrong person to question." Meanwhile, Sarah could feel the weight of the pressure bearing down on her. The glances, the whispers, and even the discreetly raised phones all made her feel as though she were standing on a public stage, her mistake laid bare before an invisible audience of hundreds. She retreated to the service area, trying to maintain her composure, but her hands trembled slightly as she checked the food trays. Emily, standing nearby, gently placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "Are you okay?" Emily asked softly, her voice full of empathy. Sarah nodded faintly, but her tired eyes betrayed her feelings. "I'm fine, but it feels like the whole world is staring at me." Emily gave a small, reassuring smile. "This will pass. What matters is that you've recognized your mistake and are willing to make amends. That's something not everyone can do." Sarah remained silent, but Emily's words gave her some comfort. She knew she couldn't immediately change how people looked at her, but she could start by focusing on her behavior for the remainder of the flight. At the front of the cabin, Melania sat still, seemingly unfazed by the attention she was receiving. She opened a small handbag, retrieved a notebook and a pen, and wrote a few brief lines. The act, though simple, exuded elegance and confidence, earning her even more admiration from those around her. An older passenger sitting nearby, who had previously spoken up in Melania's defense, turned to his wife and murmured, I've never seen someone so powerful yet so humble. This is a lesson for all of us, not to judge people by their outward appearance." His wife nodded in agreement. "Exactly, but I also hope that flight attendant learns from this." After a few moments to regain her composure, Sarah stepped out of the service area with a renewed sense of determination. She didn't want to end the flight in silence and judgmental stares. She walked slowly toward Melania, bowed slightly, and said in a sincere voice, "Mrs. Trump, I want to apologize to you once again. I was wrong to let my biases guide my actions. Thank you for your patience and for teaching me a lesson I'll never forget." Melania looked up, her eyes gentle yet sharp. She offered a faint smile, one full of grace and understanding. "None of us are perfect, Miss Montgomery. What matters is what we learn from our mistakes." Sarah felt a small weight lift off her shoulders. Though she knew this incident would follow her for some time, she understood that she was taking the first steps toward redemption. The story of Melania Trump and Sarah didn't just spread across social media, but quickly became a real-life example of grace under pressure and lessons in human interaction. The passengers in the cabin, though mere bystanders, also took away a valuable message. Not to judge others based on appearances, and to remember that respect is the foundation of all relationships. Sarah, though she didn't voice it aloud, resolved that from this moment on she would work with an open heart and a mindset free from prejudice. She knew she had made a mistake, but she also realized that mistakes don't define a person. It's how they choose to correct them that truly matters. After the flight landed, passengers began disembarking one by one. Sarah stood by the exit, trying to maintain a professional smile, though inside she felt hollow. The glances from passengers, some sympathetic, others curious, still haunted her. When Melania approached, Sarah bowed deeply, speaking with all the sincerity in her voice. "Thank you for your understanding, and once again, I apologize for troubling you." Melania responded with a gentle nod, saying nothing further, then walked away with her usual graceful elegance. Sarah watched her disappear into the distance, a wave of regret washing over her. Offering a direct apology had been necessary, but for Sarah, it still didn't feel like enough to make amends for what she believed had hurt both Melania and herself. That evening, when Sarah returned to her small apartment, she sat at her desk, pulling out a blank sheet of paper and a pen. She knew she needed to do something more, not to erase her mistake, but to show that she had truly learned her lesson. She began writing, the words forming slowly but with deep emotion. "Dear Mrs. Trump, I am Sarah Montgomery, the person who acted wrongly towards you on today's flight. I am writing this letter not just to apologize but also to express my heartfelt gratitude to you. At first, I acted out of prejudice, confident in my own righteousness. But through your response to the situation, without anger, without criticism, I realized how deeply I was mistaken, not just in my actions, but in how I perceived people. Thank you for teaching me an important lesson, not through anger, but through calmness and grace. It's a lesson I will carry with me for the rest of my life. Sincerely, Sarah Montgomery." Sarah put down her pen and read over every word. She felt a small sense of relief, as if writing the letter was her first step toward facing and mending her mistakes. 2 days later, Melania received Sarah's letter. She opened it, reading each line slowly. Her face betrayed little emotion, but her eyes reflected understanding and empathy. Melania set the letter down, picked up a pen, and wrote a short but meaningful reply. Everyone makes mistakes. What matters is how we choose to correct them. She asked her assistant to send the reply to Sarah, accompanied by a small bouquet of flowers as a token of appreciation for her acknowledgement of the mistake and courage to confront it. Sarah received the response a few days later. When she opened the envelope and saw Melania's handwritten words, her eyes brimmed with tears. Those simple words weren't just forgiveness. They were an encouragement to continue improving herself. She picked up the bouquet, smiling softly. For Sarah, it wasn't just a kind gesture from Melania. It was a reassurance that everyone, including herself, had the ability to right their wrongs and become better. From that day on, Sarah approached her work with a new attitude. She treated every passenger with absolute respect, no longer allowing prejudice to color her perceptions or actions. And whenever she felt herself slipping into judgment, she thought of Melania, her calmness, and her grace. Sarah never forgot the lesson from that day, not just because it transformed the way she worked, but because it reshaped how she saw the world. The story of Melania Trump on a commercial flight quickly became a hot topic on social media. Photos of her sitting quietly and reading a magazine, along with posts recounting the incident, spread widely. A freelance journalist's tweet from the first-class cabin garnered hundreds of thousands of likes and shares, sparking a broader conversation about biases in service industries and how people treat one another. Many expressed admiration for Melania's calm demeanor and grace in what could have escalated into a loud confrontation. An article in a prestigious magazine remarked, "Melania Trump doesn't need to speak loudly, but the lesson she leaves resonates far and wide. This isn't just about power or fame. It's about how humans treat each other, regardless of who they are." Criticism was also directed at Sarah and the airline industry in general. Some accused Sarah of discriminatory behavior, while others saw this as just one example of how much the service industry still needs to improve. Sarah read the online articles with a heavy heart. Each tweet and comment seemed to underline the mistake she had made. However, instead of avoiding the criticism, Sarah chose to confront it head-on. She approached her manager directly, admitted her mistake, and asked to take additional training on service skills and emotional management. She also requested to address her team in an internal meeting. At the meeting, Sarah stood in front of her colleagues and candidly shared her story. "I allowed my biases to influence how I did my job, but I've learned an important lesson. Professionalism isn't just about following procedures. It's about respecting everyone no matter what they look like or who we think they are." Sarah's words were not only an apology, but also a pledge for real change. Gradually, Sarah returned to her job, this time with a more open heart and a deeper sense of dedication. Passengers began to notice the difference in her service. A review from a passenger on a subsequent flight read, "Sarah Montgomery is one of the most thoughtful and dedicated flight attendants I've ever encountered. Her courtesy and sincerity made the flight so much more memorable." As for Melania, she continued her low-profile life, but the story redefined her image in a new light. A major newspaper commented, "Melania Trump doesn't need flowery words or grand gestures. Her humility and how she handled the situation sent a powerful message. Respect is not a privilege, but a fundamental right for all." Those who witnessed the incident that day still remember her, a symbol of calmness and humility amidst misunderstandings and biases. The story doesn't end with Sarah or Melania. It became a profound reminder for everyone about the power of respect and compassion. It raised a larger question. How often do we let biases affect how we treat others? In forums and discussions, many shared similar experiences, times when they had been judged or had judged others too quickly. A quote from Melania in the story was frequently cited. "Respect should not depend on identity. It is something everyone deserves." Though born from a small misunderstanding, the story grew into a larger symbol of how people can learn, correct themselves, and grow from their mistakes. After months of working with a renewed attitude, Sarah was recognized as one of the most dedicated flight attendants in the airline. Meanwhile, Melania, though she never commented further on the event, continued to inspire through her poise and the values she embodied. And so, what seemed like a minor incident on a flight left behind a major lesson that no one could forget. The story of Melania Trump and Sarah Montgomery is not just about a flight mishap, but a profound lesson in humility and mutual respect. From the initial misunderstanding to Sarah's personal growth, we are reminded that mistakes are part of being human. But how we correct and learn from those mistakes truly defines who we are. What do you think about this story? Have you ever felt misjudged or accidentally judged someone else based solely on appearances? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story and feel it brings value, don't forget to like, share to spread the meaningful lesson, and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories. Thank you for being with us.